clarification as to the specific impact on U.S. businesses of this delay. That is all, Mr. President, this amendment would do. It does not affect GSP. It doesn't affect TAA. It would not imperil this bill in the House. There is no good reason to oppose this amendment, and I hope that we can adopt it today. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Utah, sorry.
Mr. President, I'll only be a minute or two. I rise to speak in support of the amendment filed by my colleague from South Dakota. This amendment deals with an important issue, namely the cost of delay when it comes to free trade agreements. The President's desire to increase spending on trade adjustment assistance, an expensive domestic spending program of debatable worth, at a time when taxpayers are struggling to make ends meet during a recession makes no sense to me. His strategy to link passage of the FTAs to renewal of this expanded TAA program is equally perplexing. TAA is meant to assist workers who have allegedly lost their jobs due to trade, but the administration has repeatedly stated that the 3 pending trade agreements will create jobs, not cause people to lose them. According to the Business Roundtable, the passage of the 3 pending trade agreements will support 250,000 American jobs. And since jobs will be created rather than lost, it makes no sense to link the passage of an expanded version of trade adjustment assistance to these 3 FTAs. In fact, the only jobs lost to date have been those caused by the President's refusal to send these FTAs to Congress. His refusal to act has caused U.S. farmers, manufacturers, and service providers to cede our market share to our competitors in Panama, Colombia, and South Korea. Given the state of the economy under this administration, one would think passage of these trade agreements, which were handed to the President wrapped up in a bow by his predecessor, would be the first order of business. Yet here we are, more than halfway into this administration, and the President has not even made a commitment to send us a trade agreement so we can consider them. Now, my colleague's amendment would help us assess the impact of the President's delay and future Presidents as well on the American economy. The amendment would require the ITC to assess the negative impact to U.S. businesses if a trade agreement is signed but has not been considered by Congress within 2 years. Among other things, the ITC study would highlight lost U.S. export opportunities, the impact on the protection of U.S. intellectual property overseas, the impact on U.S. employment to date, and the prospective impact on U.S. employment if the agreements are not sent to Congress. If the President believes these trade agreements will create jobs, he needs to submit them to Congress. It's absurd that they're still sitting on the President's desk while our companies and workers lose market share to our competitors in Colombia, South Korea, and Panama. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I ask unanimous consent that the distinguished senator from New Hampshire be permitted to make her remarks at this time.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
I thank my colleague from Utah, and I agree with both of my colleagues who have spoken that we live in a globalized economy and that it's important for us to make sure that we have the benefits of that globalized economy here in America. It has offered us incredible new opportunities, but they're opportunities that have not been shared equally across our economy and across our workforce. I believe that when given a level playing field, the American workforce has shown it can outcompete and out-innovate any economy in the world. And that's the way we're going to get our economy moving again, by unleashing the power of American entrepreneurship. I've spoken before about ending the false debate between so-called free trade and fair trade. I think we need competitive trade, a policy that focuses on growing U.S. exports, opening new markets for U.S. companies, job training for our workforce, and tough enforcement of trade rules. We can help our workforce compete by giving them access to foreign markets. Fully 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States, but only 1% of small businesses are doing business outside of the United States, are exporting their products. Increasing our exports is vital to the long-term health of our economy. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that trade creates new challenges for many American companies and American workers. And we have to understand that no graph that shows GDP growth is a comfort to a mother who suddenly can't feed her family because her factory is shut down. And no statistic about market efficiency is going to pay a young man's rent when his company moves its engineering operations overseas. When Congress promotes international trade, it enters into a compact with all American workers that they will not be left behind. Competitive trade means making sure that all of us can compete. For nearly 50 years, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program has been lending a hand to workers who are faced with the negative consequences of international trade. It's been supported by liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans. Its premise is simple. If you lose your job to foreign trade, we'll help you prepare for a new career and we'll help keep you afloat while you train. Over the last 2 years, almost 500,000 Americans have begun a new chapter in their lives with the help of trade adjustment assistance. In 2009, Congress enacted some common-sense reforms to the TAA program. For years, Americans who lost their jobs to India or China were denied access to this program because the United States doesn't have a specific trade agreement with either country. Given the growing economic power of those two nations, that left an unacceptable number of Americans facing trade effects on their own. So, in 2009, we changed the program so that TAA supported all Americans whose jobs were sent overseas. But those reforms have unfortunately expired. This week, we have the opportunity to restore them, and we should. The 2009 reforms also updated the TAA program to protect workers in service industries in addition to those in manufacturing. 50 years ago, when the program was created, no one could have imagined the advances in technology that would allow foreign service workers and engineers to compete with our own domestic workers in those fields. This week, we have an opportunity to restore this 21st century perspective to the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. I want to share a couple of stories about New Hampshire workers who have benefited from trade adjustment assistance. The first is a story about Joanne Sanchagrin of Gilmanton, who worked at a company called Avid Thermalloy for 22 years. She was a buyer for the company, but the company was threatened by competition from several nations, including China. She knew she needed to get a new job before she was laid off. Under the old TAA terms, the ones that we're operating under now, she wouldn't qualify for help under TAA. But under the 2009 reforms, Joanne sought and received training as a licensed nursing assistant. She completed training in June, and last month she began a job in her new career, and she loves it. TAA has supported her through this process. It's paid for her training, so instead of being unemployed, she is now a dynamic part of our economy working in one of its fastest-growing fields. Another New Hampshire worker named Robert Ossino, who was a veteran, had worked for 21 years making paper at the mills in Gorham and Berlin. The paper industry has been devastated by offshore competition. As the President knows, we've lost so many of our mills throughout northern New England. And when those mills in Berlin and Gorham closed, Robert was able to use trade adjustment assistance to get his commercial driver's license at the White Mountains Community College. He recently started a new full-time job with a paving and contracting company. But TAA doesn't just help out individual workers. It also helps small businesses who are being hurt by international trade. New England Forest Products is a hardwood manufacturing company that's been operating in Greenfield, New Hampshire since 1993. But during the recent recession, they found themselves losing business to cheap Chinese lumber. In search of answers, they applied to the local Trade Adjustment Assistance Center for help. They worked with TAA to develop a marketing strategy and advertising materials that now help the small business sell their hardwood flooring and other products directly to consumers. In part because of this important program, New England forest products saw sales increase 28% in the following year. And this isn't just one encouraging story. Of the 18 businesses in New Hampshire that have received trade adjustment assistance in the last 4 years, all 18 are still operating, and many are adding employees. These are the kinds of stories that the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program makes possible, but only if we sustain these critical reforms and strengthen TAA's role as both a critical safety net and a driver of the American economy for decades to come. I urge my colleagues to support the Trade Adjustment Assistance Amendment when it comes to the floor for a vote later today. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I just wanted to emphasize one final time as we get closer to votes on these amendments. Obviously, the importance of getting the free trade agreements passed and put into force, but also the importance of understanding that as we move into the future that we not make the mistakes that we've made with respect to these agreements, and that is to let them languish for literally years, and at the same time be losing market share, be losing jobs for Americans, and be losing market opportunities for American businesses. And again, I want to point out just a couple of things that I think that really personalize this. One is, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, you have a company like Caterpillar, which makes large mining trucks, exports 92% of them, and pays a $300,000 per truck tariff to get into the Colombian market. You think of a country like South Korea, where it's the 13th largest economy in the world. They are a big importer of American agricultural goods. It's 54% right now is the average tariff on goods that are exported from the United States, agricultural products exported from here to Korea. 9% is the average tariff on their goods coming into this country. 54-9. That is an incredible disadvantage, putting American businesses at a tremendous disadvantage relative to the countries around the world with whom they have to compete. And at the same time that these trade agreements have been languishing here now for over 4 years, other countries have stepped in. The European Union, Australia, Canada have stepped in and filled the vacuum that we have left. And as a consequence, American businesses have been hurt, and been hurt profoundly. And more importantly, as we sit here in this economy that we're in today and talk about the importance of job creation, there isn't anything that we could do that would create jobs more quickly, probably, than get these trade agreements enacted. It means thousands of jobs for Americans. It means business opportunities for American businesses overseas, and it means market share that we should be maintaining or perhaps even acquiring that we're losing as a result of not having these agreements entered into force after they were negotiated these many years ago. And so what my amendment does is we look prospectively now into the future, requires that we know specifically, quantitatively, what the impacts are of delay when it comes to getting these free trade agreements not only ratified by the Congress but entered into force with these other countries. I think it's critical information that we need to know. We need to know what harm, what economic consequences as a result of these trade agreements being delayed. And I just hope that we will get a big bipartisan support for this amendment today. It doesn't do anything to alter TAA. It doesn't do anything to alter GSP. It doesn't do anything to affect passage of this agreement in the House. But it will, as we look forward into the future, I think it make it much more clear to us what these economic impacts are with regard to these trade agreements and our delay in getting them implemented. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I rise to speak about the amendment that's been introduced by the senator from Texas, Senator Cornyn. I think it's amendment number 634. I'll just take a few minutes. I know my colleague from Indiana is waiting here, but just a few minutes to speak to it, if I may. The senator from Texas has introduced an amendment that really takes an unprecedented step here in the Senate, and that is the step of actually requiring the President by mandate with respect to one weapon system, one singular amendment, to sell a specific weapon to another country. Specifically, the senator wants to take the unprecedented step of requiring the President of the United States to sell 66 new F-16 fighter aircraft to Taiwan. Now, the amendment mandates the sale of these new aircraft despite the fact that just yesterday the President and the administration notified the Congress of their intention to provide Taiwan with nearly $6 billion additional dollars of items in defense, goods and services, on top of money that they've already provided to Taiwan, including, Mr. President, upgrades to Taiwan's current fleet of 145 F-16s. Now, I will stand by my record of 26-plus years here of voting for the appropriate defense relationship with respect to Taiwan and China. And we have always respected the Taiwan Relations Act, and I think we have consistently stood by Taiwan and kept faith with that act. Without doubt, the growing military disparity between China and other countries in the region, as well as China and Taiwan, is something that we need to be thinking about and taking into account as we contemplate the long-term future of all of those relationships in that region. But that said, I am opposed to this specific amendment. And I believe that Senator Baucus, who has already spoken in opposition to it, and others, I believe, are opposed to it for two appropriate reasons. One, the substance of the amendment itself, and I'll speak to that, but also, plain and simply, this is not the right vehicle on which to address this issue. You know, consideration of TAA is part of, everybody understands this here, a very complicated approach to what Senator Thune just commented on is a much too long awaited dealing with several trade agreements that a lot of us want to pass and that we think we should pass. And passage of this TAA proposal without these other issues coming to it, which would put it at jeopardy, is critical to being able to help American workers as well as to line up those three pending trade agreements, which will create jobs in the United States and which will also enhance our security. So if we were to pass the Cornyn Amendment, which we know the administration strongly opposes, that would imperil this very carefully crafted jobs package that we are considering. On that basis alone, I would urge colleagues to vote against this amendment. But I believe there are powerful substantive reasons for why this amendment shouldn't pass just on its own. Mandating the sale of one particular weapon is not the way for the United States to respond or deal with or manage the complex national security challenge of that region and the complexity of the relationship with Taiwan. Now, I would remind colleagues that the $6 billion in new arms sales of various kinds, including a major upgrade package to all of the 145 F-16s, is an enormous, important package which Taiwan wants and needs, and which Taiwan believes will bring it up to par with respect to those systems and the needs to be able to defend itself. I think we have to remember that ever since President Nixon opened the door to China nearly 40 years ago, the United States has worked very carefully to promote peace and stability on the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwan Relations Act has long governed our policy towards Taiwan because we don't have a formal diplomatic relationship or a formal treaty. With respect to arms sales, let me share with my colleagues what the TRA says. It shall be the policy of the United States, quote, to provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive character and to maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion, which would jeopardize the security of the people of Taiwan. Finally, the TRA obligates the United States to provide such defense goods and services to Taiwan as are necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. The Obama administration and the committees of jurisdiction here in the Senate and House, with respect to it, take the provisions of that act very seriously. The administration has carefully analyzed, as have we, the military balance across the Taiwan Strait. And we have consulted closely with the government of Taiwan as to how do you best meet Taiwan's defensive needs. On Wednesday, the administration formally notified Congress of its intent to send a very substantial retrofit package that would upgrade the current fleet. As I mentioned, there are 145 F-16s that Taiwan has today and that Taiwan relies on today for its current defense needs. These upgrades include state-of-the-art avionics and weaponry, active electronically scanned array radars, targeting systems, the AIM-9X air-to-air missiles, and precision-guided munitions. So I don't believe there's any question but that the United States of America is going to be, is now, and will continue to be in full compliance with the requirements of the TRA. But it also makes clear, this package, that support for Taiwan is not a partisan issue, Mr. President. The Bush administration, in its 8 years, 2 full terms, notified Congress of the sale of roughly $15 billion total in arms sales to Taiwan. With the announcement of the sale that the administration is making of the additional items that Taiwan needs, the administration, the Obama administration, in less than 3 years has approved the sale of over $12 billion in arms to Taiwan. So, Mr. President, you got $15 billion over 8 years for the Bush administration. You got $12 billion over 3 years for the Obama administration. Moreover, the administration's $5.8 billion retrofit and training proposal, the necessary parts, equipment, training, logistical support, all of them provide a cost-effective upgrade of Taiwan's current status, and most importantly, what it would do is elevate Taiwan's current fleet of F-16s to a level of capability consistent with the most advanced export variants of this aircraft. So let's understand where we are, what the state of play is. Taiwan has an urgent defense need today. They have 145 aircraft. We already sold them. We're prepared to provide them an upgrade that brings those aircraft up to the total state-of-the-art of the most advanced export variant that we are allowed to export to another country, and it will prevent these 145 aircraft from becoming obsolete. This is the most sensible, cost-effective, effective way to provide an upgrade and to provide Taiwan with the capacity that it needs. Now, to the degree that people are thinking jobs in the United States of America, what about selling, well, a lot of us have never believed we ought to use the defense sales, weapons sales. If you want to create jobs, there are a lot of more effective ways of creating jobs. But to whatever degree anybody wants to measure this by that standard, the fact is that a $5.8 billion sale announced yesterday will be welcome news to the workers of Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Pratt & Whitney, and many other defense firms. I emphasize again, that's not the rationale for the sale, and none of us should resort to those kinds of sales for the purpose of jobs. But if that's going to be a measurement here or a consideration in anybody's mind, make no mistake, the $6 billion that the President has proposed will have its own impact. Finally, let me point this out to colleagues, and I think it's an important consideration. Nothing in the proposed upgrade package will preclude the United States from providing new F-16s as we go down the road, as they may be necessary, as a judgment is made about them, or any other similar platform to Taiwan in the future. And the administration has taken pains to make clear to Congress and to Taiwan that the approval of this sale does not and will not prejudice any future decision on new aircraft. Yesterday, President Ma Ying-jeou of Taiwan said that the upgrade to Taiwan's existing F-16AB jets are aimed at maintaining the country's self-defense capabilities while pursuing peaceful development across the Taiwan Strait. He said of the upgrade package, quote, this is the President of Taiwan saying, "We have to develop peaceful ties with mainland China, but we haven't for 1 second let our guard down when it comes to Taiwan's security." I don't believe the Taiwanese believe that they're letting their guard down. I don't think they believe that we are not meeting their needs. Obviously, Congress has an important role to play in determining how to meet those needs. But I don't think that we should, in the wake of the evidence here, make an independent judgment outside of what is already happening. We certainly shouldn't blindly defer to the executive on Taiwan arms sales, but I think to compel the executive to make a specific arms sale to a specific country measured against the steps already taken and the steps being taken would be an unprecedented intervention by the United States Senate under circumstances where there just has not been made the kind of compelling, urgent argument that that's the only way to proceed. So I would urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment when the time comes for us to vote on it, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I yield myself 5 minutes out of my remaining time.
Without objection.
And I thank my colleague from Indiana. I just want to respond briefly to the Senator from Massachusetts. This isn't an assessment that I have made that Taiwan needs these aircraft. This is one made by the Department of Defense in their 2011 report on military power, China's growing military power. And they detail the increasingly precarious situation in the Taiwan Strait, stating that China seeks the capability to deter Taiwan independence and influence Taiwan to settle the dispute on Beijing's terms. So it's clear from both the press reports from the state newspaper, the very bellicose comments, that this is really an attempt by the mainland China, the People's Republic of China, to intimidate not only Taiwan, but also the United States. And we should not give in to that intimidation. Now, this chart, which I've pointed to earlier, demonstrates the growing imbalance in the Taiwan Strait. This is why these additional aircraft are needed. The red one is 2,300 operational combat aircraft from the People's Republic of China versus 490 operational aircraft, combat aircraft for the Taiwanese. The senator from Massachusetts is correct that the upgrades, to this extent, that the upgrades are welcome. on the 145 F-16s that we had previously sold to Taiwan, but it's not adequate because 100 of these aircraft currently operational by Taiwan are obsolete and going to be retired. Taiwan has intended that the new F-16 C and D series replace the fleet of F-5s. Those are previously sold U.S. aircraft from the 1975 to 1985 range, which are now old and obsolete, and then the French Mirages, the French-made 2005 fighters. So 100 of these planes demonstrated here, the 490, are going to be retired, and the 66 aircraft that are the subject of this amendment will replace some of those retired vehicles. So I don't think thinking about the future of our relationship with Taiwan or problems we may see on the horizon is enough. We need to do something now. And I would also point out that you can't just take the production line at Lockheed Martin and basically eliminate it because there are no further demands or contracts for F-16 sales. You'll have to basically, all the personnel, the 2,300 people who are directly involved in those jobs will be reassigned or be fired, let go, because there's no contracts in place as late as the fourth quarter of this year for new F-16s. So I think looking at this down the road doesn't take into account the current loss of jobs or the disruption of disbanding this production line, which cannot easily be reconstituted if there are no contracts, including the sale of these 66. With that, I would reserve the balance of my time and yield the floor.
Mr. President. Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, could I inquire with the allocation of time here? The Senator from Vermont has generously yielded me the opportunity to just speak for a few moments. I just want to make sure I don't get the situation mixed up here so that we've run out of time. What's the allocation?
Senator from Florida, Senator Rubio, has 17 minutes. Senator from South Dakota, Senator Thune, has 9 minutes.
All right. I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that I just take 6 minutes of Senator Rubio's time.
Without objection.
Of course, would not object, but I'd also ask consent that upon completion of that, I be allowed 7 minutes as though in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd just like to respond to some of the statements that have been made here relative to the continuing resolution, which hopefully we'll be voting on today, if not today, tomorrow. There's no question on either side of the aisle here as to the need for emergency supplemental appropriations for fiscal year 2011 disaster relief. There's agreement on both sides of the aisle that FEMA is short of money to meet immediate needs in this fiscal year, 2011, which expires at midnight on September 30th. And so the disaster relief fund is very low. And on September 9th, the President requested $500 million in emergency appropriations to finish out the immediate needs between now and the end of this fiscal year, which is just a little more than a week away. And that has been provided and taken care of. As we know, the House is working on sending the Senate a continuing resolution that includes this emergency funding and more than the President's $500 million request. The House CR is expected to include $774 million for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, plus an additional $226 million for the Army Corps of Engineers for emergency flood control. This emergency funding is not covered by the Budget Control Act, and so the House, in accordance with procedures that we've been going forward this year and trying to be as careful with taxpayers' money as we can, the House offered an offset for that. That was defeated yesterday in the House. I think they're working on a bill now to hopefully bring it over to us with some minor revisions. Now, while this funding covers FEMA's immediate needs, as requested by the President, through the rest of the fiscal year, the House bill also includes additional funding at the current level of $2.65 billion in fiscal year 2012 for FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund, which will provide the necessary funding to deal with the requests and make sure that people get the support that they need from losses in the various disasters through this continuing resolution period, which will go to about November 18th. It's important to note that despite some of the things that have been said, Republicans support disaster funding. It's critical to respond to the many disasters that have affected so many states over the past few months. We support that effort. However, the additional funding for fiscal year 2012 sought by Senator Reid and Senate Democrats is not needed immediately. In fact, the President has not requested immediate passage of any of this additional funding beyond what is needed to provide FEMA what it needs to address the situations and to make the necessary payments between now and the expiration of this current resolution, which we'll be voting on here today or tomorrow. Now, this is not to say that we should not consider additional disaster relief. We will. There are many challenges out for states that states face in response to the disasters that have struck across the country. My own home state of Indiana has experienced floods that merited a disaster declaration from the President earlier this year. We are in no sense in the same plight as many states that have had disasters far and above what we have faced in my own state. But it's important to note that as a nation, we need to step forward and address these immediate needs. But we have a process in place to do this. The Budget Control Act that Congress passed in August does allow a process for providing disaster relief in fiscal year 2012 through a disaster cap adjustment. As a result from that, the Senate Appropriations Committee, in which I'm the ranking member on Homeland Security Subcommittee, which oversees FEMA, that committee has been considering the fiscal year 2012 bill and has included disaster assistance where appropriate, pursuant to the disaster cap adjustment in the Budget Control Act. The key words here are where appropriate. There may be looming disasters in front of us. We hope not, but we're still in hurricane season, and we need to be in a position to be able to provide additional funding should those disasters occur. But there is no need to go forward with what Senator Reid has proposed, and that is dumping a lot of money that has not yet been certified as needed into an expenditure, particularly at a time when every dollar of expenditure needs to be carefully weighed in terms of our current fiscal situation. Some have noted that while the CR may adequately fund FEMA, it does not address the other agencies that need disaster funding. If that's the case, then why has not the President requested these additional funds immediately? On September 9th, I quote the President, he sent Congress his request for additional FEMA disaster funding, including the $500. I ask unanimous consent for just one more minute. Thank you. If this is the case, why did he not ask for this? We don't need to include this additional funding to meet the needs of the people for the disasters that have already occurred. This funding necessary to do that is included in the House bill, which we'll be voting on. Republicans want to ensure that the communities devastated by disasters receive the resources that will help them rebuild. We recognize that American citizens have had their lives turned upside down by Mother Nature, and the CR will provide adequate disaster relief through November in accordance with the President's request and FEMA's stated needs. As a result, there's no need to add all of this additional assistance immediately as part of the CR, and I urge members to support passage of the CR that the House will be sending us shortly.
Senator from Vermont.
President, I have spoken many times here on the floor, as has the distinguished presiding officer, about the disaster and tragedy Vermont faced with Hurricane Irene, we all learned with profound sadness that Master Sergeant Sean Stocker of the Vermont Air National Guard suffered a fatal heart attack while working on a road reconstruction project in Cavendish, Vermont. Sergeant Stocker was the first sergeant of the Vermont Air Guard Civil Engineering Squadron. Of course, in Vermont, we mourn that loss, and our thoughts and prayers are with Sergeant Stocker's wife, Christine, their children. I told her that when I spoke with her today and told her that I would talk about him on the floor and his sacrifice. It struck me in what happened how much it says about Vermont and our National Guard. Sergeant Stocker and so many of his fellow Guard members have answered the call to help their neighbors in need. When Sergeant Stocker passed away, his troops gathered. They want to know how best to honor his memory that day. And they decided to keep right on working to help their neighbors in Cavendish. Quote, "It is what Sean would have wanted us to do," close quote, they said. Sergeant Stocker and these other troops put their country first and do whatever their mission requires. But we have talked so often of the loss and suffering in Vermont in the aftermath of Hurricane Irene. And of course, one key component of that response is skillful and tireless work of the Vermont National Guard. From the very beginning of the disaster up until today, the Vermont National Guard has been deployed to help Vermonters in need. I spoke to Secretary Panetta last night here in Washington. I told the Secretary what a great job the Vermont Guard is doing. Let me show you my colleagues a photograph. This photo is from a Vermont Guard airdrop of supplies to a Vermont town. That town was totally cut off. The only way we could get these supplies in were bring them by helicopter. In the days following Irene, the Vermont Guard immediately went to action and made sure storm victims cut off by Irene's destruction received emergency supplies. Helicopters airdropping food and water. And of course, our Guard leadership reached out to other state guards through Vermont's emergency management assistance compacts for help with long-term projects. I know I talked with the senators from Maine. They told me how happy their Guard was to be able to come down and help out. So it demonstrates the versatility of the Guard. In addition to meeting immediate needs, the Vermont Guard has taken on other major projects such as debris removal and road construction. As in so many other states, when Vermont has a need, our National Guard is there. Often they're the first to arrive, they're the last to leave. And the Guards who come to Vermont to help us, Ohio, Maine, West Virginia, Virginia, South Carolina, Illinois, a few of the Guard units have come to Vermont's aid. All of the Guard units in the area, from New York on through, have said, we're here, call us, tell us what you need. That's one of the things we love about the National Guard. When one state needs help, every state steps up. And one thing Vermont did need in the immediate aftermath of Irene was helicopters. The distinguished presiding officer and I helicoptered around the state. But it was regrettable that our state needed more airlift in part. Why? Because many of our Black Hawk helicopters were still in Iraq following a recent deployment. We had the most modern Black Hawks in the fleet, but they were in Iraq. In this season of war, we should take a moment to remember the troops and equipment sent overseas are not going to be available to help out here at home. We need them in an emergency. And like that deployment of equipment, every dollar we spend on conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan is one less dollar we have to invest in recovery and rebuilding here in America. This is a time to choose investment here at home first. When I hear people tell me that we can't pay for disasters in America unless we take money out of education or medical research or other things that Americans need, but we can sign a blank check to rebuild Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm saying, let's worry about America. Americans need help. Americans need help. We're asking for a tiny percentage of what some spend on a credit card for Iraq and Afghanistan. Come on home. America needs us. Citizens of our state have suffered because of natural disaster, and men and women of the Guard who come to their aid deserve nothing less. So, what have we done for the last couple of decades, the last decade? 2 wars waged on the nation's credit card. Well, we didn't totally ignore taxes during that time, even though every other war the country has been in, we've always raised the tax to pay for it. We did pause to throw ourselves a party in the form of tax breaks tilted toward the very wealthiest among us. These policies are wrong. Every war in this nation, we've tried to pay for it. This war, we said, let's borrow the money. And now, after all these years of funding wars and rebuilding other countries overseas, the leadership of the House of Representatives, in the continuing resolution that body defeated yesterday, brazenly told the American people we can no longer afford to come to the aid of Americans in need, our fellow citizens here at home. No, now we need to offset the cost of rebuilding America by cutting something to help someone else. This is Alice in Wonderland. Are they asking the wealthy to pay their fair share? No. Are they asking oil and gas companies with record profits quarter after quarter to sacrificing their tax giveaways? No, they are not. Are they asking those people to get tax breaks for shipping American jobs overseas? No. That's wrong. We can't ask these suffering people to sacrifice or refuse to ask those that have the most to contribute their fair share. We can't cut programs that are going to create new jobs and basic safety net help for struggling families and seniors, while giving every break possible to the very wealthiest among us. It's unconscionable. It's not the American way. I have been privileged to be in the Senate representing our great state of Vermont for 37 years. We've always dealt with disaster bills together. We've worked across the aisle in the spirit of bipartisanship. Vermonters have not asked, why do we help out an earthquake in California? We do it. Vermonters don't ask, why do we help out in Louisiana or Texas or Virginia? We do it because we are the United States of America. We work together. We can't afford to toss aside that tradition. The decision of some to inject politics and political point scoring into disaster relief is a new low for Congress, a Congress already scoring records for unfavorability. Leader Reid is right to call for a continuing resolution that includes an emergency disaster relief package that will get aid to all 50 states suffering from the effects of unprecedented natural disasters, and acknowledging the fact none of us can predict where the next disaster is going to occur. Except that every one of us in our life experience know there will be some. We can try to rebuild Iraq and Afghanistan, and nobody questions that. Rebuild America. Rebuild America. So I encourage my colleagues here, the House of Representatives, to do the right thing for people who need our help and move forward with Leader Reid's bill. Fellow Americans need the support. Now is the time to act. Let me show you another photograph here to my colleagues. Again, look at our National Guard working to put these roads in. They're stretched thin, just the National Guards all over this country, because so many of them serve overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are talented engineers, talented men and women, people who know what to do, have the equipment, can do things that nobody else can do, certainly not in our little state. Let's start spending some time worrying about America. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of quorum, time to be equally divided.
Without objection, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I rise in opposition to the Casey Reed amendment. Over the past several days, we've had the opportunity to publicly discuss and debate a number of serious flaws in the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program and its proposed expansion. Perhaps the most egregious aspect is voting to spend more taxpayer dollars on an expanded domestic spending program of dubious value at the very same time our colleagues on the SIPRA committee are scrutinizing every penny of federal spending in a bipartisan effort to get our federal deficit under control. It makes me wonder whether this body understands the gravity of the deficit we are facing. As a country, we are simply spending more money than we have. If it continues, we are going to be bankrupt. We'll bankrupt our country and leave behind a grim future for our children and grandchildren. Now, you will hear many of my colleagues talk about how important it is to spend this money, and I'm sure a lot of them will feel good about their vote, but we all know that the good feeling that comes from buying things we can't afford is fleeting, while the debt accrued hangs like a dark cloud over our daily lives. We simply cannot afford to continue to spend money our country does not have. This is why I, for one, am voting no. Despite my concerns, I am convinced that this amendment and bill will pass. This spring, the President made it clear that if this domestic spending program is not expanded and approved, he would abandon our allies in Colombia, Panama, and South Korea and cede these growing markets to our foreign competitors. How short-sighted. While the President may have been willing to accept that outcome, many of my colleagues were not. They stepped up to the plate and vowed to support efforts to move the process forward. As a result, the deck in favor of this bill was stacked long ago. Still, I am glad that we have had an open debate on the merits of this program. Earlier this year, the President attempted to shield TAA from strict scrutiny and debate by jamming it into the South Korea implementing bill. Doing so would have been a clear abuse of U.S. trade laws and would have denied the Senate an opportunity to fairly debate and amend TAA. The American people deserve better than this, and Finance Committee Republicans fought hard to ensure that this did not happen. It's largely a result of our efforts that we're here today. Even though the deck was stacked against our amendments long ago, this discussion has been a useful exercise. It has been over 9 years since the Senate engaged in a real trade debate on the Senate floor. Senators deserve an opportunity to have their voices heard on issues related to international trade. And by engaging in debate, we are honoring our Republican constitutional traditions. We are doing what the American people expect us to do, openly discussing problems, and in doing so, hoping, helpfully, to resolve them. During this debate, a number of amendments were offered that enabled senators to go on record regarding their trade priorities and core beliefs. For the first time in years, we were able to draw clear distinctions between rhetoric and action. Of course, there has been debate about the merits of the free trade agreements themselves. As I noted earlier, the President and many of my colleagues who purport to support these agreements made it clear that in reality they only support the FTAs in exchange for something else. That something else turned out to be a demand for more spending. I am worried that going forward, this pattern will continue. I certainly hope not. As a nation, we cannot afford to hold our international economic competitiveness hostage to unrelated demands for more spending or for a more liberal social agenda. During the course of this debate, I have expressed my concerns that the real cost of the TAA expansion bill is unknown. Recall that benefits under TAA are paid out on top of unemployment insurance. which is supposed to take care of those who are out of work. As more and more people take advantage of the program, and as the number of weeks of regular unemployment insurance contract, the cost of this entitlement program could spiral out of control. So a number of amendments were offered that would help constrain its future growth so that we do not end up sticking the American taxpayer with another out-of-control spending program. Every single one of these amendments were rejected by my colleagues across the aisle. Their passion for spending runs so deep that even an amendment by my friend and colleague Senator Cowell, which implemented one of President Obama's recommendations to cut TAA funding for firms, was rejected. At a time when the Supercommittee is struggling to cut spending in areas such as defense and health care, I find it astonishing that my colleagues cannot support eliminating a program that even President Obama agrees should be cut. That's a true rarity. My colleagues, that is, that President Obama agrees to any kind of a cut. Not that my colleagues won't support eliminating a program. That we know has happened around here for all of the 35 years I've been in the United States Senate. But even when President Obama, one of the biggest spenders in the history of the world, agrees that a program should be cut, they won't even do that. My colleagues across the aisle also chose to reject an amendment to provide their own president with the authority to negotiate new trade agreements. Can you believe that? We all know that the authority to negotiate trade agreements expired years ago. Since then, the United States has been fervently sitting on the sidelines while other countries negotiate agreements all around the world. Everyone knows that if you're not in the game, you don't even have a small chance to win. Right now, the United States is not in the game. While it is true that the President is in the process of negotiating an agreement to create a trans-Pacific partnership, we all know that the chances of it actually succeeding are almost non-existent without trade promotion authority. And while the pro-trade rhetoric sounds good from the other side, when it comes down to concrete action, President Obama and his Democratic colleagues are absent once again. I am perhaps most disturbed by their rejection of my amendment, which would have made the expansion of this domestic spending program contingent upon submission, approval, and signature of our pending free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. This amendment simply held President Obama accountable. The President said that there would be no FTAs unless Congress passed TAA. The insinuation is that if Congress does pass TAA, the President will submit, support, and sign all three FTAs. Yet even today, we do not know if that is the case. My understanding is that the White House has given no indication that they will actually submit these agreements for a vote. Now, that is truly pathetic. But they're willing to spend more. They're willing to pass TAA so they can spend more, regardless of whether they're sincere about doing these free trade agreements that will provide almost 250,000 new jobs in this country, or at least jobs. My amendment simply called for presidential accountability. But even presidential accountability was rejected by the other side. Once again, pro-trade rhetoric of the past several months is shown to be nothing but a facade. I will be voting against the amendment to expand TAA, and if it is approved, I will be voting against the final passage of the bill. I simply cannot condone more spending on a program of dubious value at a time when our nation is clearly broke. I remain hopeful that President Obama will submit our pending free trade agreements to Congress. If he does, and they are approved, I am confident that President Obama and his team will drape themselves in the pro-trade flag and claim responsibility for moving these agreements forward. But the fact of the matter is that the authority to negotiate these agreements and the actual negotiation of these agreements themselves is due to the hard work and late nights of President Bush and his team. This is one instance where President Obama can rightly place responsibility at the feet of his predecessor. My Republican colleagues and I put forward a number of amendments during the week to constrain government spending, open foreign markets for our products, and hold the President accountable for his rhetoric. Unfortunately, every single one was defeated, mostly along party lines, but we will not be deterred. We will continue to fight against out-of-control government spending. We will continue to fight for presidential authority to open foreign markets to U.S. exports. We will continue to fight for transparency and accountability in our international trade policy. And while we may not win the battle today, I am confident that we will win in the end. Over the next year, I plan to conduct rigorous oversight over President Obama's trade policy. If these agreements are eventually submitted and approved, I will work hard to make sure that they enter into force quickly. I also plan to conduct extensive and continued oversight over the operation of the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. I am convinced that it is a flawed program and that strong congressional oversight will help expose those flaws. I will also work hard to make sure that our next president, whoever that may be, has the authority to negotiate strong trade agreements that tear down barriers to American exports. Over the past several days, many of my colleagues expressed interest in updating this authority. I welcome that interest and want to express my sincere desire to work with them to immediately see that trade promotion authority is renewed. Our nation and our workers cannot afford to wait. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.